Hey guys, welcome back to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel. My name's Austin and I'm excited to announce that we're finally putting a lift kit on this Jeep J10 truck. And that's made possible by our friends over at Rough Country for sending over a 3-inch suspension lift kit. Now if you guys are following along and doing this lift kit yourself, this lift kit fits a variety of FSJ Jeeps, not only the J10, but it fits the old Grand Wagoneers as well as Wagoneers, anything that's leaf sprung all the way around. Now Rough Country makes a variety of lifts for many vehicles, so if you guys want to check out if they got a lift kit for you, make sure to check out roughcountry.com. So we got a lot of work, and this is going to be part 1 to this 2-part series. Today we're going to be knocking out the front suspension, so we got a lot to go over, so let's get started. Alright, so this is our suspension lift that we're going to be installing today. This is only the front section, as I mentioned before, since this is going to be a 2-part series on lifting it. Today we're knocking out the front suspension. So right here we have our front leaf springs, we got our front shocks, we got our front U-bolts, then we also got some hardware going along with our U-bolts. Then we also have to install our bushings into our leaf spring eyelets over here. Now this suspension lift kit right here is the full leaf packs all the way around. I opted for that since the old ones are pretty worn out, but there is a slightly cheaper kit that you can get that comes with new leaf springs in the front, and then it comes with blocks to lift up the rear. Now taking a closer look at the components, we got some heavy duty leaf springs up here, and like I said, we have to install some polyurethane bushings that are provided in the kit. Now going over to the shocks, this is pretty standard on most of their lifts. This is the N3 series shock, so it should be a lot better than the old worn out ones that are on here. And they look a lot more heavier duty with a thicker piston coming out the end over here. And then they also did come with some bushings if we need to opt for that to press into here. But we'll have to take a look at that with the bolts that we're using. Now coming over to the U-bolts, you may notice that we have 2 different sizes, and that's because on the front axle of this J10, it has a Dana 44 front axle. And then the way they have this set up is that they have these smaller U-bolts on the driver's side, and that's going simply around the axle tube. And then they have some big ones over here that are actually going around part of the pumpkin that's on the passenger side. So that's why there's 2 separate sizes over here, and then it also did come with some hardware. And then another nice thing is that Rough Country did also provide some instructions. Got a little crinkled from shipping, but this is going to be great for doing all the torque specs on all the bolts. So we'll be able to name those out and get everything installed correctly. But overall, this is a nice basic kit for pretty much just lifting it. There is going to be a few other things that we're going to have to be replacing, such as sway bar links, sway bar bushings, and upper shock towers. We're going to take a look at that, see if we can save them or if we need to get new ones. As well as maybe some steering stuff in the future, but I'll be going over the steering and stuff in a whole separate video. So what I'm going to get started with right now is getting the Jeep up in the air on the front end, and I wanted to actually remove the sway bar links and upper shock towers, see if I can get those sandblasted, and that way it's all going to be nice when I put the new parts on there. And then we'll start tackling the bigger things like the leaf springs, get those all unbolted. And I do want to take the spring plates that bolt to the underside of the leaf spring, since the front end of this is actually a leaf sprung under the axle. And I want to get those sandblasted and painted up so when we install everything, it's all going to be nice. So let's get started on removing the upper shock towers as well as some sway bar links, and we'll move on to the leaf springs after and start removing all the old stuff so that way we can install the new. Alright, so looking inside the driver's front wheel well over here, now the first thing I want to do is actually remove the old shock towers as well as the sway bar links, because those are some hard to find parts, and if you do find them, they're actually really expensive. So what I want to do is actually get these off here, and my friend's going to sandblast them, and then I can paint them, and they're going to look all nice and brand new when we install all the other parts for the lift. So all these bolts look pretty rusty, so what I'm going to do is take some knocker loose penetrating oil and put them on all these threads and let them soak for a little bit. And I'm not going to take my chances. I'm going to use some heat right away and heat up the nut on here and hopefully be able to break these free. Now we got to be especially careful since we're saving these upper shock towers. This is actually a stud here, so we really want to make sure that we don't snap off the stud in here. So I'm going to go around and spray all the bolts. So this nut up here on the top of the shock looks to be 11/16, so I'm going to get that ready. Now I'm going to start my heat and see if we can break free that nut. Now we do want to be careful since we do have some fuel lines just on the other side of this fender liner, so keep that in mind when you're doing this. And this might actually be the original shock over here, because I think this used to be like an AMC sticker on here. The other side's actually been replaced, but they all definitely need replacing. Now I'm going to break these free by hand. I don't want to risk it with the impact and possibly snap a bolt, so I'm going to start off there and see what happens. I'm going to shock it a little bit more with some penetrating fluid. Looks like it broke free, hopefully. Fortunately, snapped that side. That's going to change some plans. Might end up just having to buy some new brackets. There's a company called 999 Off-Road, I believe, and they make some brand new factory towers that are actually a little bit more beefier than this over here. Now, if I wanted to, I could save these and weld a stud in there, but I feel like it's just going to be faster if we get new brackets. Alright, so down here, this is going to be a 3/4. Might just throw an impact on this. If it snaps, it's not a big deal. It's just a generic 1/2-inch bolt. Alright, that came out. Now we can take the rest of the shock. And now for the sway bar link, working on this bottom nut over here. And this is actually a stud going into the leaf spring plate. And it looks to be 11/16. Hopefully this guy comes out and doesn't break. I had a power steering leak, so it's covered in oil, so hopefully that'll help free this up. There we go. That guy definitely turned. This guy up here is a 3/4. Since I jacked this up first by the axle, I don't have enough room between the frame to get a socket on here, so I just got a wrench. Alright, so believe it or not, the sway bar link was still stuck in there even though I got the hardware off. Up here on the top, it's actually a tapered fit inside of this sway bar, so it's similar to a tie rod end or a ball joint. So I used a pickle fork and heated up this sway bar a little bit, pounded it in between there and broke that free. Then on the bottom it was just kind of tight, probably because the sleeve of the bushing is probably seized onto that shaft. So I'm just prying that out of there and we'll remove this the rest of the way. There we go. Alright, so now we're removing this upper shock tower the rest of the way since we're going to have to replace it to put new ones on there. It's looking like we got 3 1/2-inch bolts going all the way through the frame, a couple of them tying to the motor mount on the other side of the frame, and I'm really expecting these guys to snap off, so I'm just going to use the impact right away and going to have to replace these bolts and just go to the hardware store, get some grade 8 bolts to replace it when I reinstall it. So I'm just going to use my impact and see if we can zip these off. If it starts spinning from the back side of the frame, I'll have to get a wrench or something on there to keep that into place. And it looks like that's spinning, so I'll get a wrench. Ooh, that actually came out. It's one rusty bolt. Definitely needs replacing. Diameter's changing on that because of the rust. Holy rust. And that bottom bolt is actually threaded into the frame. Luckily that didn't break. But holy rust hiding under there. Rust and a bunch of road gravel. Alright, so with the parts that we just took off, we got our upper shock tower, our sway bar link, and our old shock. Obviously, with this rough country kit, we got some new shocks, so we're going to discard that. And with these sway bar links, I'm going to try and save them. I'm going to pound out the old bushings. We're going to have to reuse this taper piece up here, and I'm going to get these all sandblasted, since I believe a new pair is $100, and these don't look too bad, just some light surface rust, so those should clean up nicely. On the other hand, this upper shock tower, I try to get that nut off with some heat and penetrating oil. Unfortunately, it snapped on me, so I'll have to order some new ones to get that ready for installing the rest of the lift, but you guys will see that real soon. But just take a look at all the stuff that gets caught up in here from 40 years of driving this truck. All the road gravel and road salt just kind of collects up into here, and as you guys saw when I took this off, all the mountain of crap that just fell out, and you can see it all caked down here. So this is a major rust spot. So maybe with the new brackets I might drill holes so that way any water or anything in here can drain. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of the other side off camera, get these ordered, get these sandblasted and painted, and you guys will see that here real soon. And I'm going to run to the hardware store and get some new bolts for this as well, and probably for some new leaf spring bolts. Alright, so after removing those small components, now we're moving on to the leaf springs, and I want to reposition my vehicle to get it supported in the correct way. As you can see right here, I got the jack ready underneath the front axle and some jack stands supporting the axle when I was taking off that other little stuff. But now what I want to do is actually lift up the front of the vehicle and put some bigger jack stands underneath the front of the frame and let this front axle drop down, so that way we'll be able to unbolt our leaf springs from the axle, and then we can have the jack here to slowly lower the axle down. And anytime you're lifting a vehicle and getting a wheel off the ground, you always want to chalk the tires that are on the ground. So I got the rear wheels right now all chalked up, so that way this thing is not going to roll. And if you have a parking brake that works, unfortunately this does not, you want to set that as well. So let's get this jacked up, and we'll put some jack stands underneath the frame. Alright, so I got some jack stands underneath the frame. I'm going to take these other jack stands out from underneath the axle. Now I'm going to slowly lower the front axle with the jack, but I'm still going to leave a little bit of tension on it, so that way when we undo the leaf spring, the axle won't just fall out. Alright, so I just have a little bit of tension on the front axle with the jack, because the next thing we're going to do is actually unbolt the U-bolts that strap the springs to the axle. Now, since this is a spring under, we don't have to worry about the axle completely falling out, but we still don't want it to slide around, so that's why we have that jack there. So now for unbolting the spring plate, we basically got our 4 nuts, which are going to be a 7/8 from the factory on here, and we also have some other bracketry coming off. Now, as you guys saw earlier, we took off the front sway bar links. That's what bolted onto here. And then off camera, I actually unbolted the steering stabilizer, which goes to this top stud over here, which is basically just on the driver's side for the 78 J10. So as far as unbolting these, I'm not going to worry about putting some penetrating oil or heat on these, because if they break, we got brand new ones that are going to go on anyway. You do want to put new ones on, since U-bolts like to stretch over time. So I've just got my impact right here, and we're going to see if we can knock these free. Now, I did have to swap to a chrome socket just because the way I got it lifted up, there's not quite enough room, so we're going to see if this takes them off. Alright, so what I did was actually lift up the axle a little bit, just to be able to use that impact grade socket, because I don't want to crack that chrome socket. And because we got a little bit of tension on the spring, I put a jack stand underneath the leaf spring, so that way when this does break free, it's not going to smush my impact gun into the ground. So hopefully we can heat this up enough, maybe spray a little bit of fluid on here. Alright, so trying to get those nuts off really isn't going to happen. It wasn't budging with my 1/2-inch Milwaukee impact, and trying to heat it up with just a map torch is going to take a long time for that to break free, unless you have a acetylene torch that might work. But I'm going to do the more dangerous and quicker method. That's actually just to cut the old U-bolts. So I've just got an angle grinder with a cutoff disc in here, And I'm going to be wearing a face mask as well as some safety glasses because I don't want anything flying. So I got the tension released on the spring, so I just have the jack there holding the axle in case it's going to shift or anything like that. So I'm going to cut it up here on the top. I'm probably going to have to cut it a couple times for it to be able to fit out. So hopefully this all goes well and nothing's going to go flying. There goes one of them. Alright, looks like most of the tension's off, so I'll cut it on this side as well, so that way we can pop them down through. Alright, so that's all the way through. There's the upper part. There we go. Now with our spring plate, we'll just hammer out these remaining U-bolts. They're just rusted in there. And then I'm going to get this guy all sandblasted and painted so it looks nice when we install the new leaf spring. So as you can see, there's obviously two pieces to the spring retainer. We got our main, looks to be 1/4-inch plate that has the sway bar link coming off of it. And then we also got this thicker cast piece down here that's going to bolt onto the bottom. Alright, so by jacking that front axle up a little bit, it lifted this axle up away from the leaf spring. Now we got our upper leaf spring bracket up here. We're going to have to hammer that free because it's probably rust welded to the upper end of the leaf spring. There we go. Alright, moving on to the passenger side, I'm going to go straight to cutting like I did on the other side. But as you can see, these are the bigger U-bolts that go over here, and they actually go over part of the pumpkin onto this cast piece, so they're going to be a little bit bigger, just keep that in mind. So I'm going to cut them like before, get the plates off, and then we'll be ready to unbolt the leaf springs. There goes one. Now on this side, there's actually not an upper leaf spring plate, so we don't have to worry about that. Alright, so now that we got the U-bolts off, our front axle is completely disconnected from our front leaf springs. So what I'm going to do before we unbolt the leaf springs is to actually raise up the axle a little bit and put some other jack stands on it, so that way it's supported by that and not just the jack right here. In case the axle wants to lean one way or another, we don't want it to be falling down and possibly gripping on a brake line. Just had to break the other side free, but as you can see, the axle shifted a little bit, so we're going to try and rotate that. So I'm going to put some jack stands underneath here. Alright, so now it's time to remove the leaf springs. I'm going to start up here, unbolting the leaf spring from the leaf spring shackle. And depending on the condition that your shackles are in, you can take those off and replace the bushings, which I'm probably going to do. So I'm going to take this off as well, but to start off, I'm going to undo this one and then the back leaf spring bolt, and then we'll undo the shackle. Now these bolts right here, I did spray ahead of time, so hopefully they'll break free and we won't have to cut them. And the nut over here is going to be a 7/8 and the bolt head is going to be a 13/16. There we go. Now I'm going to zip the rest of the bolt out, and this leaf spring is going to drop down. And actually, while I'm here, I'll just unbolt this right away as well. Now I got the nut off, but the bolt is still stuck in there, and hopefully it's not frozen up on that sleeve since it is a little bit tight getting in here, so I'm going to have to use an adapter since it's so close to the steering box. Well, I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to have to do with that shackle, but we'll get the other leaf spring bolts out for now, so we'll tackle this front one as well. Alright, so it's actually looking like these bolts are rust welded inside that metal sleeve that's in the bushing for the shackle. And it's a common problem on the Jeep Cherokees as well, and unfortunately you just have to get a Sawzall and cut this bolt out. So I'm going to have to do that at a later time. It's loose in here, there's no nut on it, it's just seized inside of that bushing. Alright, so now same thing for the rear end of these leaf springs. Alright, so we got some bad news back here as well. It looks like this guy is stuck in the inner sleeve there, so we're going to have to cut that out as well. We'll try the other side on the back of the leaf spring, but odds are it's going to be the same case as this. Alright, so I'm going to try cutting out these bolts with a cutoff wheel right here. Hopefully I get enough in there, otherwise I'm going to have to use a Sawzall. There we go. Alright, so on the back side of that bolt, I ended up just cutting it flush with the outside of the bracket, so we'll have to wiggle this out of here, and it might have to expand the bracket just a little bit to be able to get it out. So I'm just going to wiggle around the leaf spring, maybe get a pry bar in there, and try to get this out. There you go. And there's spring number 2. Alright, so I was able to cut out the front shackles over here, and this is what I was talking about as far as the bolt getting stuck on the inner sleeve of the bushing. As you can see, it was just seized up inside of there, so I went on each side and took a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder and got them cut. But looking at these shackles, they're actually not too bad of shape, other than the bushings. They obviously need to be replaced, but there's no major scale or anything, and actually you can still see the part number on the back of these shackles. And since they're not too common to find these shackles anymore, people want an arm and a leg for them, I'm going to press out these old bushings, get them all sandblasted and painted, and then we'll install some new ones. Alright, one last thing I want to take care of for removing stuff is these old bump stops that are bolted to the bottom of the frame. Once I get that off, I'm actually going to clean up the frame a little bit and wire wheel and paint that so it looks all nice when we install our new stuff. So I'll have to order some new bump stops since this is all rotted out and the bracket is just rusted to pieces underneath it. So it's held in by 2 half-inch bolts. Let's see if they come out. And they snap. I'm going to try and heating these up a little bit, but I'm still doubting on them coming out without snapping like the last one. Just because feeling inside the frame with this hole right here, there's so much dirt and everything built up. So the back side of the bolt's probably so rusted into place since there's no drain holes actually on the bottom of the frame. But we'll try anyway. Oh, it actually came out. So I guess I'll do the other side, try and heat them up and get that side out as well. And I'm going to clean this stuff all up off camera since it's kind of boring, and then we'll be back to install our new parts. Alright, so moving forward, one thing we can do right now is install some new bump stops. I went on quadratech.com and got some new bump stops for the J10. They're pretty universal fit for all the older Jeeps. They said these ones fit a CJ and they're pretty much the same ones that are for the J10. Now I would like to work on some leaf springs and get those new ones installed. As you can see over here, these are the old Shackles that I had my buddy press out the old bushings and sandblast them, and they actually turned out pretty decent. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting on the bushings to get them reinstalled right now, but you guys will see that here shortly. So one thing I'm going to do right now is install these new bump stops. I'll post a link in the description below and where you can find all these little accessories and stuff like that. And these are pretty cheap, only like $5 or so. And it's definitely a good replacement since the rubber is going to break down over the years, as it did over here, and the mounting bracket's all rusted out. Now you guys saw I did break one bolt. Off camera, I went and drilled and retapped that inside the frame, and I got some new 5/16 hardware so we can install that as well. So let's go over to the Jeep and start installing these. Alright, so looking inside the passenger side wheel well, as you can see, the frame is looking a lot different. Off camera, I went and wire wheeled this whole section here, got pretty much down to bare metal, and then coated it with a couple coats of PR15, then did some self-etching primer, then I did some semi-gloss ceramic engine paint. I've seen a couple of YouTube channels use it before, and I started using it myself compared to the Rust-Oleum, and I actually like it a lot better. Dries nice and hard in 24 hours, even if it is 40 degrees in here or so. So I'll definitely use that paint a lot more often when doing these little projects. Another thing I did was I replaced the engine mount bracket bolts that go through the frame right here. The reason why I did that, once I pulled out the bolt, the actual shank of the bolt is actually pretty rusty and a little bit thinner than the 3/8 bolt how it's supposed to be. So I did one at a time, put two new bolts going all the way through. There's one thread into the frame coming from the back, and then when we install our new shock towers, they're going to utilize 3 bolts up here and also tie into that motor mount bracket. But those are still in back order, but we'll see them here soon. Now one thing I want to do before I install the bump stop is actually take a tap and just kind of chase the threads. Make sure there's no paint or any rust buildup in there, even though the bolts came out nice. I just want to make it so it's nice and clean for the new bolts to go in through. Now this thread that's going into the frame, it's going to be a 5/16 by 18. And I don't have a tap tool, but you can use a 10mm socket, and it fits right into the 1/4 inch end. And you want to put your extension and the tap kind of like half and half in here, and I've been getting away with this for a while, so it seems to work for me. There's some rust and crap falling out, so we'll just chase this through both of the holes. Now when I install this new hardware for the bump stop, I'm just going to use a little anti-seize on this. That way if I have to take these off, maybe put some extended ones on in the future, that the bolts won't break off. Then we'll tighten these up with a 1/2 inch. Alright, so there's that. I'm going to go do the driver's side and then we'll be back. Alright, so our shackle bushings finally showed up, and I went and got one of them installed on one of our shackles off camera, and it actually went surprisingly easy. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it on this next one right here. Once again, these were sandblasted, and my friend actually took a big hydraulic press and got these out, and they were kind of a pain in the butt to get out. As you can see, part of the tooling for the hydraulic press kind of bent that a little, but shouldn't be too big of a deal. The inside we'll just maybe need to grind off a little bit. That way there's no burrs or anything when we install our new one. But what I did to install these, since I don't have a hydraulic press, was basically use my ball joint press. I put a little bit of grease around the outside of the bushing here, and if you want to, you can heat up this with a torch. That way it expands a little bit, and then it pressed in pretty nicely. By the way, these are off Quadratech. These are Crown Automotive bushings, and they're pretty universal, but these are meant for the shackles over here on the J10. Post that in the link below. So let's get started, and I'll show you guys how to install this bushing. Alright, so don't mind the background noise, that's just my diesel heater since it is winter time. But to start off with, I'm just going to see if there's any major burrs in here, just kind of clean it up with a file. Now this is my setup for the ball joint press. I just basically have the end going over here. It's a perfect diameter to fit the end of the shackle over here. Then I just have one of these adapters that was in my ball joint kit, and it seemed to work perfect on here. Now ideally you don't want to press in on the rubber or the inner sleeve here, because it could detach from the outer sleeve, but there really isn't anything I have that's going to fit this outer sleeve right here. But installing the last one, it didn't seem to matter. It still pressed it in nicely. So I'm going to lube this up with a little bit of grease on the outside, and then we'll get ready to install this. So I'm going to start it just with a hammer, make sure it's going in straight, and then we'll put it in our ball joint press. So it is going to compress that rubber a little bit just till it gets that outer sieve on this adapter. I'm going to see if it's going to start going in. Otherwise, if it's going to be a little bit tough, I'll add some heat to the outside of the shackle, and then it should slide in nice. Looks like so far it's going in pretty nice. Alright, so I'm starting to feel it bottom out. I'll back off on it. Alright, and that looks actually pretty centered in there. So that's all ready to go. I'm going to clean up both the shackles, get them primed and painted, and then we'll be back ready to install this on the Jeep and then get the new leaf springs in. So for installing the new polyurethane bushings and our new leaf springs, it's pretty simple. We got 2 halves going into it, and then we install our metal sleeve once that's in there. And to help install these, I'm going to put a little bit of grease on these, and with polyurethane bushings, you really want to use a silicone-based grease, nothing petroleum, because that's going to eat away at it over time. So I got some dielectric grease, which is actually silicone-based, so that's going to work fine for this. So I'm going to lube up all the mating surfaces and get it ready to hammer in. These go in pretty smooth, you don't need any special presses or anything like that. And with these leaf springs, they got a smaller eyelet on one side and a bigger one on the other, so that's why there's 2 different sizes. I'm doing the bigger one right here. It's going to slide in nice like that. And now I'll take a mallet and hammer this in all the way. There we go, that's all there is to it. I'm going to repeat the process on the other ones, and we'll get these all ready to go. Alright, so I went and painted the shackles and have them baking next to the heater right now. So the next thing we can do is start to bolt our leaf springs onto the vehicle. I'm going to start over here on the rear leaf spring mount on the front leaf springs. And if we recall, the bigger eyelet on the leaf spring is going to go towards here where there's no shackle. So I'm going to get this all prepped up to bolt into place. I'm not going to tighten anything down until the whole suspension is on here and the Jeep is back on its full weight. Now, since these are polyurethane bushings up front, I'm just going to put a little silicone grease on the inside of this bracket right here, so that way it slides in a little bit easier, and it should work well with those polyurethane bushings. So since we had to cut off a bunch of those old bolts, I had to go out and buy some new ones. These are just your standard 9/16 bolts, and they're about 4.5 inches long. Got some washers and a locking nut with it. And before I install this, I'm going to put some anti-seize on the bolts, so that way they don't freeze up like how they did before and we'll have to cut them off. I'm going to do the outside of the bolt here and the inside of that metal sleeve in the leaf spring bushing. Now I'll fit our leaf spring up. I have it underneath the front axle right now. I'm actually slid in pretty nice. We can take our bolt and line it up. Might have to hammer the end a little bit because got a little bit of paint buildup in the hole. Washer and a nut for the back side. I'm just going to leave it loose for now until we get everything in. Alright, so now moving on to the front of the frame, we're ready to install our shackles. I was able to reuse a couple of the 9/16 bolts and had them sandblasted and just repainted them, so that's why I got some black bolts here, but they're the same exact size. And this is what our shackle looks like, all painted up. It's dry to the touch, but not 24 hours dry yet, but should be fine for today. Now, if you guys recall on the orientation, now this was installed, the welded end is facing towards the front of the vehicle, so it's going to be kind of slanted towards the front over here. Now, bolting this up to the frame should be fine. Now, one thing I actually noticed is on the shackle, I widened up the forks here before I painted it. I noticed on the polyurethane bushings on the front of the leaf spring here, they measured to be 3 inches wide, and I believe with these shackles, they're meant to be 2 3/4. So I had to widen this up a little bit, and once we tighten it down, it should straighten out a lot. So I'm going to get some anti-seize, and we'll get this bolted on. Alright, so that did not work out, putting the used bolts back in there with them painted. That extra thickness of the paint just kind of jammed up in the bushing, and I ended up having to pound it out. And when doing so, it actually pounded out the bushing. It wasn't quite tight enough, so I went back and just put some tack welds around the shackle, so that way the bushing stays in there a lot better and shouldn't back out at all when the suspension's under operation. And I got some new bolts, so we're going to put this back into place. And then we got a washer and a nylon lock nut for the other side. Now we'll grab our release spring, pivot it up, and line it up to the shackle. And then once again, a washer and a lock nut on the other side. So now I'm just going to take up the slack in these bolts, not tighten it and torque it down yet. We'll do that later on. Okay, now we'll go to the other side and get that side leaf spring in as well. Alright, so I just got done fixing a mistake I made with these leaf springs, and I'll explain that to you. So I just picked up the directions, and I should probably have looked at it before I did the install, but I thought it was pretty straightforward. But there's one thing that I missed out, and with these 74 through 90 FSJ Jeeps, when you're installing this kit onto there, if you have the front leaf springs 8004, you actually have to install them opposite of what you would do for the factory springs. And what I mean by that is normally the bigger eyelet on the leaf spring goes towards the frame where there's no shackle and the small one on the front, but that's not the case here. We actually have to flip it. And the reason why it's like that is I actually installed it the incorrect way the first time, and what I've noticed is that the pinion angle on the front axle with the drive shaft, it was actually pointing a little bit further down. As you can see, it's a lot more straighter, and once this gets onto ride height, that's going to be pointing basically directly at the transfer case, which is basically what you want for a slip joint drive shaft. And another way you can check if you're right or wrong is that you can take a measurement from the centering pin on a leaf spring to the leaf spring eye on one end, and you basically want it so that the longer length is going to be up here towards the front of the vehicle, and the shorter length is going to be over here to the back. So that way this front axle kind of sits with the pinion a little bit up compared to further in the leaf spring where it's starting to arch up and it's actually pointed down. So I had to go back, take off the leaf springs, flip them around. A little bit time consuming, and I didn't really want to keep taking the stuff apart, but I finally got it finished. So let's continue and keep working with getting this lift done. And now the next thing we're going to do is actually bolt the front axle to the leaf springs. As you can see, I actually cleaned up some of the axle tube and painted it, so that way when I go and finish off the rest of the front axle for painting, I don't have to get around any of these connection points or anything like that, so I know it's all cleaned up. I also went ahead and took all of our brackets that are going to be bolted in with the U-bolts. I had my friend sandblast them and I painted them, so these are all going to be brand new, and they should look pretty nice when we bolt everything together. Now, since this is a spring under front axle, all we really have to do is just lower the jack stands down and line up our alignment pin that's on our leaf spring right here. This is going to correspond with the hole that's on bottom of the leaf spring perch right here. You want to line that up on both sides. Now, one thing to consider, if you do have this bracket, it's going to go in between the leaf spring and the front axle. This is for our steering stabilizer, so I'm going to add that in there before we get everything bolted up, and then the rest of the brackets are going to go and bolt onto the bottom of the leaf spring. So I'm going to lift up on this axle and actually just get this jack stand out of here since it's not too heavy. Slowly lower it down. As you can see, you can twist this whole axle, so we're going to have to do that to get everything lined up. Put our bracket down into place. It's going to line up with that center alignment pin. Now we'll get the other side and it'll fall into place a little bit better. You might have to do a little bit of shimming, move the leaf springs around and the axle to get everything lined up. Alright, so I got the axle pretty much lined up. It's locked in on the other side, and what I'm noticing over here is that the alignment pin that's on the leaf spring is not actually long enough to be able to go through the stabilizer bracket, and the axle, as you can see, it still does move around, and if you don't have this bolted in the correct position, you're going to have some alignment issues. So what I think I'm going to do is actually just get rid of the stabilizer bracket, and later on in the future, when I upgrade the steering, I can simply just weld on a tab on the axle tube right here if I wanted to add a steering stabilizer. So for now, we'll just take this out. There we go. That's nice and locked in. Now we can get our U-bolts through and then start bolting on our brackets and tightening it all up. Alright, starting over here on the driver's side, I'm going to start off by putting the U-bolts through. They're going to go straight down. I'm going to get some anti-seize on the threads here. You don't really have to worry about them backing off since we got nylon lock nuts, but we will have to retorque them after 100 miles or so. Now we got our spring plate, and this has the tab right here for our sway bar link, and it's orientated like this, the way that we took it off, so we're going to guide this into place. And then next we have our big cast piece. This is going to lock everything together. I actually had these bottom plates mixed up, so you want to make sure you have it on the correct side, since the other side U-bolts are a little bit bigger. But got this in, take some washers and our nut, and thread it all in. Alright, now I'm going to snug these U-bolts up. I'm not going to torque it down until we get the other side in. And as we're tightening it up, you want to go in a crisscross pattern, so just kind of go back and forth between the two U-bolts. That way you're not tightening one side down further than the other. And another thing to keep in mind is try and get these U-bolts as straight and perpendicular to the axle as possible, so you don't want it like bent out or anything like that. So just keep that in mind as you're tightening it up. Alright, now time for the passenger side. We got our bigger U-bolts over here. Alright, so now that all the U-bolts are snugged up, I'm going to go and torque down all of them to 60 foot-pounds, and that's what's required for these half-inch U-bolts. Alright, so that's all of them. One thing to note with these U-bolts, after 100 or 150 miles or so, you're going to want to retorque them, because U-bolts, especially if they're new, they like to stretch a lot. Alright, so we're making some good progress on our lift kit right here, and all we got to do to finish up the front suspension here is install our new shock towers, our new shocks, and then put our sway bar assembly back together. Now unfortunately our upper shock mounts are still on back order, as well as our sway bar bushings that I ordered for the front here, so I really can't continue much further on this. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for today's video. In the next video, we're going to button up the front suspension and then get to the rear. We're going to have to do some more rust repair on that, as well as put some new leaf spring hangers in there, since the older ones are rotted out, but that's all going to be included in the next video. But we still made some good progress in this video, and everything's looking really nice, especially with me painting the frame, getting all that rust off and everything like that. Alright guys, so that's going to be a wrap for today's video. I want to thank Rough Country again for sending out the lift kit for me to be able to install and show you guys how to do it for your full-size Jeeps. Now make sure you guys stay tuned for part 2. We're going to button up the front suspension and get that rear knocked out. And if you guys have any wheels or tire suggestions for this Jeep J10, let me know in the comments. The lug pattern on this Jeep is 6 by 5.5, and it has to be able to accommodate the front hubs, which I believe are 3.5 inches in diameter, but I'll have to double check on that. And I'm thinking right off the bat, 33-inch tires would look good on this. I don't want to go too big and put too much stress on the drivetrain. It's not really going to be much of a rock crawler, more of like a show truck, but I still want to do a little bit of off-roading with it. So as always, I'll put all the links in the description below on all the parts that I used in this video. And if you guys liked this video and found it helpful, make sure to like and subscribe to the Out Jeeping YouTube channel to help keep these videos coming. If you have any questions or comments, post them below and I'll be happy to answer. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.